ठंडा पानी ही पी रहे, कुछ खा नहीं पा रहे, सिर्फ पानी पी के पेट भर रहा है गर्मी की वजह से।
पसीने में हो रही है, गमछे पूरा गीला था, सूख गया बिल्कुल।
But the world is not lost at 1.5.
हमारी ह्यूमन बॉडी है 35 से 38 टेम्परेचर यूजुअली सहन कर लेती है।
What happens at this threshold? The world doesn't end.
El Nino does change and shift rainfall patterns seasonally and in pretty persistent ways.
When you hear people talk about climate change, a certain phrase and number comes up all the time. It's called 1.5 or 1.5 degrees Celsius. Let's take a look at what it really means, what it doesn't mean, and are we close to hitting it? In 2015, the world agreed in the Paris Climate Accord to try to keep warming to about 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, above pre-industrial times. What they mean is about 1850 to 1880. We're at about 1.2 or 1.3 degrees Celsius now. Or, in other words, 0.5 degree Fahrenheit, thereabouts, from this threshold. What happens at this threshold? The world doesn't end. But scientists have compared a world with 1.5 degrees of warming to a world with 2 degrees of warming or 3 degrees of warming, and they find that many of the things we really appreciate, like certain ice sheets and glaciers and coral reef, are far more likely to survive at 1.5 degrees of warming than they are at 2 or higher. So we are so close to that 1.5 degree threshold that if we continue on the current pace, in less than 3 years, in early 2028, we will have made 1.5 degrees inevitable. But the world is not lost at 1.5. It is just a danger line that we cross. And just because we step over the danger line doesn't mean with a lot of effort later, we can't take a step back and remove some of that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and reduce temperatures.
The intense summer heat in Uttarakhand is not only disrupting daily life, but is also becoming a major health hazard. With maximum daytime temperature crossing 40 degrees Celsius in parts of the state, doctors have warned that prolonged exposure to such extreme conditions increases the risk of serious heat-related illnesses, including heat stroke.
आमतौर पे जब भी समर स्टार्ट होती है तो लगभग 35 से 38 डिग्री टेम्परेचर हम लोग सहन कर सकते हैं. हमारी ह्यूमन बॉडी है 35 से 38 टेम्परेचर यूजली सहन कर लेती है, बट जब टेम्परेचर 39-40 डिग्री होता है ना, तो बॉडी का जो थर्मोस्टाट है वो डिसरेगुलेट हो जाता है. तो ऐसे में ना हीट स्ट्रोक होने का डर रहता है.
The rise in temperatures has led to local hospitals witnessing an unusually high number of patients seeking treatment for complaints of vomiting, diarrhea, nausea, and severe dehydration. According to doctors, young children are among the worst affected.
अभी जब से मई स्टार्ट हुआ है, गर्मी का काफ़ी असर दिखाई दे रहा है बच्चों पर. यहाँ पर उल्टी दस्त की ओपीडी बहुत ज़्यादा बढ़ गई है. लगभग 90% पेशेंट उल्टी दस्त से ही आ रहे हैं और कई मरीज सिवियर डिहाइड्रेशन में भी जा रहे हैं, जिससे कुछ बच्चों की इवन जान तक नौबत आ गई, जान जाने की भी नौबत आ गई.
Many local residents say they've never experienced such extreme heat before, with outdoor movement becoming unbearable during the daytime.
गर्मी ने तो भैया सारे रिकॉर्ड तोड़ रखे हैं. बिल्कुल आप देखेंगे अगल बगल कहीं भी आपको कोई चलता फिरता नहीं दिखेगा दोपहर में. 12 से 4 तक तो लॉकडाउन जैसी स्थिति लग रही है. बस ग्राहक या तो सुबह और शाम ही निकल रहा है.
इस समय तो बहुत भीषण गर्मी का प्रकोप है. मैं तो कह रहा हूँ इस समय घर से निकलना ही नहीं चाहिए. दोपहर में 12 बजे से लेकर शाम के 4 बजे तक बहुत ही ज़्यादा गर्मी लग रही है. मेरे से बर्दाश्त नहीं हो रही है.
Some say the heat is particularly harsh on daily wage earners who have no option but to continue working in these conditions to earn a livelihood.
इस गर्मी में रोडें देखो खाली पड़ी हैं, बिल्कुल कोई घर से बाहर निकल नहीं रहा है. मुँह से कपड़ा बांध कर निकल रहे हैं यहाँ से. और इस गर्मी में मजदूर लोग ज़्यादा परेशान है बेचारे, पानी से भी, और काम उनको मजबूरी में इस धूप में करना पड़ रहा है, जिसकी वजह से क्योंकि उनको शाम को भरपेट खाना खाना है, सुबह रात को सोना, सुबह फिर उठ के फिर आना है इस समय.
As temperatures continue to rise with little immediate relief in sight, authorities have advised people to stay hydrated, avoid direct exposure to sunlight, and keep children indoors during peak afternoon hours.
We're coming out of a La Nina event right now. Over the past year, we've been in a La Nina, which is the cold state. Right now, we're in neutral conditions, and we're trending towards El Nino, and that's certainly what the forecast models are saying we're going to continue to head into is El Nino. The fuel for a big El Nino is there. We carefully measure the temperature of the ocean below the surface, and that's kind of where the extra heat is hiding. It's a question of whether that bubbles up to the surface or if it stays lurking below the surface, out of sight, out of hidden from the atmosphere. So the potential for a really big, super El Nino, if you like, is there, but definitely an El Nino this winter. My name is Chris Karnauskas. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences and a fellow of the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder. I study tropical climate dynamics and physical oceanography. El Nino affects the weather all over the world, and it affects economies, agricultural sectors, but it affects everywhere a little bit differently. So for example, during an El Nino event, we tend to expect a warmer western half of the United States. Different parts of the US, for example, will be wetter during an El Nino, and different parts will be drier. So it's not a globally consistent effect. It is very regional in terms of how an El Nino event will affect one location or another. An El Nino event, such as the one that's being forecast, would have a myriad of impacts around the world. For example, vector-borne diseases such as malaria or West Nile virus that depend on how much water is available for mosquitoes to breed, for example. El Nino does change and shift rainfall patterns seasonally and in pretty persistent ways. So this could set up places that don't normally see vector-borne diseases like Zika or West Nile virus or malaria to have more of a prevalence of the insects that spread those diseases. Also, water managers in places like the western US that are already dealing with water shortages. This is something to be aware of, whether you're in a part of the country or in the world where we're expecting more or less rainfall due to an El Nino event. This is something where several months in advance now you can start to prepare and make changes to try to mitigate the impacts of the changing water supply this year. No two El Nino events look the same in the tropical Pacific. No two El Nino events bring the same impacts all over the world. There's a pattern for sure, but there's differences, and those differences can be the difference between getting extra rainfall and the neighboring state getting that extra rainfall. So these subtle differences are really important. We can't just take this one-size-fits-all mold and assume that that's exactly what's going to happen if an El Nino happens this year. Typically, when there's an El Nino event, there's a temporary spike on top of the upward trend in global temperatures. And when there's a La Nina event, there's a temporary dip that shows up in the global average temperature. For 2026, it's early. It's only May right now, but if there is a big El Nino brewing and it manifests the way that the forecast models are predicting that it will, that would certainly help 2026 reach new records in terms of global average surface temperature. There's no formal definition of a super El Nino. What that sounds to me like is a very strong El Nino, and we've had a lot of strong El Ninos in the past. For example, since the satellite era began in 1982, we've had, I would say, 4 or 5 pretty strong El Ninos that you could point to and say those were super El Ninos. If the forecasts for this year actually come true, it would put this El Nino at the 5th strongest El Nino since 1982.